before I get started, I just wanted to address one thing that Doug mentioned. If in fact you do start asking him questions about me, I'm going to set up on the other side of the lobby and answer questions about you all. So just be prepared that if I go down today, you're going with me, and we will go down together. But glad that Doug is here. He's a guy that I respect immensely, and I hope you'll take the chance to get to know him a little bit and then go and listen to what he has to share about Kentucky Christian. Now, unless you're a person who's really into art, if someone were to ask you to name a famous painting, you probably would have a very limited number of options to choose from, at least if you had to pull them from memory. So, for example, you might remember Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night. You might remember The Last Supper. If you're a person who got into watching the Bob Ross documentary on Netflix during the COVID shutdown, you might remember the name of some of his paintings. If not, you certainly remember his incredible haircut, even if you don't remember the names of his paintings. But most of us don't have too many to choose from, but one that you might choose and that almost everybody remembers is Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. I've got a picture of it as it hangs in the Louvre Museum. Some of you might have seen it. What you may not realize, though, is that over the centuries, there have actually been dozens of different copies or imitations of the Mona Lisa that have garnered a lot of attention. The most famous copy of the Mona Lisa is known as the Hecking Mona Lisa. And it was purchased at a yard sale back in the late 1950s by an antique dealer named Raymond Hecking. I've got a picture of him just so you can put a face with a name. And it wasn't long after purchasing this copy at the yard sale that Mr. Hecking became convinced that what he had purchased was actually the original, which meant that the one that was hanging in the museum was actually a fake. And if you go online today, you can still watch this. He then personally financed a documentary in which he tries to weave together all these different conspiracy theories to prove that the one that he bought was the original and the one that everybody thinks is the original is actually a fake. Unfortunately for him, nobody in the art world found his claims compelling. And today, it's universally agreed upon by art historians that the copy that he bought for $4 at a yard sale in 1957 is actually a 17th century copy by an unknown artist. Now, here's where it gets really crazy. Fast forward to June 20th, 2021, just 2 years ago. That was the day when the famous auction house Christie's agreed to auction off the Hecking Mona Lisa as a way of commemorating the 500th anniversary of the production of the real Mona Lisa. So I've got this picture of these two paintings side by side, and you can probably tell which one is the original and which one is the copy. Now, keep in mind that by this point, everybody in the art world knew that this copy that he purchased at the yard sale was not the real thing. It was simply an imitation. In fact, one of the historians, as they advertised this for Christie's auction house, advertised this way. She said, "It looks like the Mona Lisa, but the quality and execution is not Leonardo da Vinci." Now, don't rush past that description. I want you to imagine, what if you could get by with advertising other things like they advertise this painting? Or how about this? What if you could get by with advertising and describing yourself like they described this painting? So this past week, I thought about putting this on the church website just to see if anybody would notice. Joe Tipton is a lot like George Clooney without the quality and execution of the real George Clooney. Just think about it. Think about how you describe something that's kind of like it's real, but it's really fake and everybody knows it's fake. Now, right from the beginning, they advertised this as an imitation, and they assumed that when the auction day came, it might raise a couple $100,000, maybe $250,000, as some collector wanted to use it as a conversation piece. But that's not what happened. Instead, when the day of the auction arrived, an unnamed European art collector had the winning bid of $3.4 million to buy a painting that everybody knew was fake. The spokesperson for Christie's auction house described it this way. She said, "This is madness." Now, if you're anything like me, you hear that, you got some questions, right? Assuming you had $3.4 million in disposable income, why would you use it to buy something that you knew was fake? But if this story of the fake Mona Lisa tells us anything, it's another reminder that as human beings, all of us have been endowed with this incredible ability to delude ourselves into thinking that things we know are fake are actually real. And in one sense, you could say that may be our biggest problem. If you have your Bible, I want you to turn to Exodus chapter 32. Over the last few weeks, as Anita mentioned, we've been doing this deep dive into the life of Moses. We've called it shadow work because, as we've said all along, long before Moses ever stepped into the spotlight, there were a lot of things that God had to do in the shadows to help him become the person that he was created to be. And if you were here last weekend, we left off at the end of Exodus 19. And Moses and the people of Israel are right in the middle of this 11-month camping experience in front of Mount Sinai. And one of the things we really tried to drive home last week is that it was during those 11 months that Moses established this rhythm in which he would go up on the mountain and hear from God, and God would tell him things that he needed to do and things that he needed to know. And so from Exodus 19 until Exodus 31, what you have are 12 chapters of the people of Israel getting organized. God says, here's what you need to do, here's what you need to know, here's how you need to function together to form this new nation. And keep in mind, this is not a small group of people. This is 2 million plus people, and they've never been anything but slaves. So this is a monumental deal for them to get organized. After the service last week, Van Phillips stopped me in the lobby. He said, this would be kind of like if we took half the population of Kentucky, we all walked to the Grand Canyon, and then when we got there, we decided to start a new nation. That's kind of what this would be. It's a pretty good comparison. They've got laws to write, traditions to enact, festivals to celebrate, worship services to conduct, and all of that is happening in these 12 chapters. And so from Exodus 19 until Exodus 31, it looks like it's a slow process, but it's finally starting to look like things are coming together until you get to Exodus 32. Because when you turn the page from 31 to 32, while Moses is up on the mountain talking to God and kind of doing his thing, down at the base of the mountain where all the people are located, the wheels are starting to come off. If you have your Bible open or your phone, I want you to look at verse 1 with me. Exodus 32, verse 1. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what's happened." So by this point, Moses has been up on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. And the people have been watching for him. They don't know exactly where he is. They're not sure if he's coming back. And if he's coming back, they're not sure when he's coming back. So they're starting to get antsy. So they go to Aaron, who's Moses' brother, and they say, look, we need somebody that we can rally around. We need something that we can worship. Now keep in mind all the things they've already experienced through Moses' leadership. Slavery from freedom. They crossed the Red Sea. And they got this pillar of cloud in the day and a pillar of fire at night. They've been fed this manna in the desert. And they've been through all of these incredible experiences. And yet all it takes is one bump in the road. And what are they ready to do? They're ready to throw all that away and chase after something that they know is not real. And then you get to verse 2, and rather than calling a timeout, almost unbelievably, Aaron bows to the pressure, and he does the unthinkable. Check this out. Aaron answered them, "Take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing, and bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought us up out of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord. So the next day the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. Afterward they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revel. If you go back, Exodus 20, God gives Moses the 10 Commandments. Some of you remember that. And right off the bat, in just one action, Aaron and the people of Israel break the first 2 commandments. Exodus 20 says it like this, and God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth or beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Now, if you're like most people, whenever you think about the 10 Commandments, you probably tend to think about the last 8, right? Because honestly, the first 2 are the ones that most of us are convinced that we haven't broken, right? It's like you read the list, you're like, man, I know I haven't always done too well with the greed thing or the lust thing, and I haven't always, honored my father and mother, and I'm not always, I've not done a very good job of never bearing false witness, but at least I've never, taken all my jewelry, had it melted down, formed into some kind of idol, and bowed down in my living room and worshiped it, right? I mean, it's like, at least I got those 2 right. And maybe if God, grades on a steep curve, maybe I'll get it. Most of us read this and we're like, I've done some dumb stuff, and I've made some big mistakes, but thankfully I've never done anything like that dumb, right? I've never bowed down to an idol. Most of us have convinced ourselves that this is something that people in other parts of the world may struggle with, but that somehow we're kind of immune to this. But the truth is, it's a little more complicated than that. Each week during the series, we tried to give you one big idea that we hope you'll grab onto. And for this week, here's the big idea you see in Exodus 32. It said, idolatry is the sin underneath every other sin. Let's say it again. Idolatry is the sin underneath every other sin. Most of the time, you think about sin, if you're like most people, you probably think about specific things that God said not to do that you sometimes still do without ever pausing to think about why you do those things. And believe it or not, the Bible actually answers the why question. It's just that it answers it in a way that a lot of us fail to recognize. You go back, you do a close reading of the Old Testament all the way through the New Testament. You know what the number one sin that the Bible talks about most is? It's not lust or greed or pride or any of the other things that we tend to obsess over. Instead, it's idolatry. Because underneath all of those other sins that we sometimes struggle with is the sin of worshiping things that we know are not real. Kyle Ottoman said it like this in his book, God's, where he said, idolatry isn't just one of many sins, rather it is the one great sin that all others come from. If you start scratching at whatever struggle you're dealing with, eventually you'll find underneath it is a false god. Idolatry isn't an issue, it is the issue. All roads lead to the dusty, overlooked concept of false gods. Deal with life on the glossy outer layers and you might never see it. Scratch beneath the surface and you begin to see that it's always there under some other coat of paint. You listen to this last slide. There are 100 different symptoms, but the issue is always idolatry. Do you know it's very possible that up until this point, you've been battling against something that's not even your real issue? So just like a headache or an unexplained pain somewhere in your side can sometimes be a symptom of a disease that's much more serious. Sometimes those little sins that we struggle with and that we obsess over and that we battle against are simply a symptom of idolatry that's infected our hearts. Just think about it like this. If I came to you this morning, I said, I want you to name the sin that you struggle with most. My suspicion is you'd say greed or lust or pride or maybe some addiction that you struggle with. But what the Bible teaches from really the Old Testament all the way through the New Testament is that underneath all of those other sins that we struggle with is the primary sin of idolatry. And you see a perfect example of it here in Exodus 32. One of the questions you might be wondering as you read this part of the story is that after all the people of Israel already been through, how could they so quickly turn back and pursue after these other gods? And it's a great question, but you have to remember, for the previous 400 and some years, they had been living in Egypt where they were surrounded by all of these false gods. I mean, Egypt was just filled to capacity. One writer said in ancient Egypt was like the Baskin Robbins of false gods. You could pick and choose any flavors you wanted. And now, for the very first time in their lives, they've escaped all that, and they're being confronted with the claim that there is only one true God who demands our absolute allegiance. But what I want to make sure you understand is that this is not just a story about them, it's a story about us. It's not just a story about something that they struggled with, it's a story of something that we struggle with as we struggle to confront our number one problem. And so you get to verse 7, and God interrupts his meeting with Moses, and he instructs him, he tells him what's going on at the base of the camp. And I want you to look at how Moses responds. Verse 7. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go down, because your people whom you brought up out of Egypt have become corrupt. They've been quick to turn away from what I commanded them, and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They've bowed down to it and sacrificed to it and have said, 'These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt.' I have seen these people," the Lord said to Moses, "and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them and that I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation." So as a leader, here's Moses, and he once again finds himself in the unenviable position of having to confront a serious issue that threatens to derail everything that God is trying to do through these people. But before he can go back down the mountain and address the issue with the people, he first has to convince God not to destroy the people. So you get to verse 11, and Moses gives us an example of what repentance looks like. Check this out. "But Moses sought the favor of the Lord his God. 'Lord,' he said, 'why should your anger burn against your people who you brought out of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say it was with evil intent that he brought them out to kill them in the mountains and to wipe them off the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce anger. Relent and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember your servants Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to whom you swore by your own self, I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give your descendants all this land. I promise them, and it will be their inheritance forever.' Then the Lord relented and did not bring on his people the disaster he had threatened." Did you know that even when God has every right to destroy you because of how much you've messed up and how much you've turned away, there's a part of him that still wants to forgive you? So one of the things the Bible teaches is that while God is holy and he can't just overlook our sin, he is also infinitely loving toward us, so that even when we're at our worst, he still wants nothing more than to be in a relationship with us. And so Moses, as he prays this prayer, instead of making excuses for the people, instead of trying to make it sound better than it really was, he simply reminds God of the promises that he made, and it says that God relented. And so that gives Moses the opportunity to try to put this thing back together. So he goes down the mountain, and what you see in this next part of chapter 32 is Moses leading the people through this process of confronting their idols. It's a three-step process. So if you're tracking with us, here's the first step in confronting this. You have to identify your idol. What happens in verse 15? "Moses turned and went down the mountain with the 2 tablets of the covenant law in his hands. They were inscribed on both sides, front and back. The tablets were the work of God. The writing was the writing of God engraved on the tablets. When Joshua heard the noise of the people shouting, he said to Moses, "There is the sound of war in the camp." Moses replied, "It is not the sound of victory. It is the sound of defeat. It is the sound of singing that I hear." So in this instance, not really all that difficult to tell what's going on. Moses comes down the mountain. He sees the people partying around this golden image. He immediately knows what's happened as he begins to put the pieces together based on what God has already told him. And by this point, it's completely out of control. Everybody's drunk. Everybody's doing crazy stuff. And so Moses just looks and he takes it all in and he knows what he has to do. But sometimes it's not that easy to identify. Sometimes those idols are a little more carefully hidden. Back in 2009, Tim Keller wrote a great book that you ought to read titled Counterfeit Gods. And he talks about idolatry and how it connects to our modern culture. And in the book, here's how he defines an idol. He says an idol is anything that absorbs your heart and imagination more than God. Now I want you to notice that word, anything, because it can literally be almost anything. He then goes through and he identifies several categories of idols that we sometimes struggle with, even without realizing what's happening. For example, he uses the category of theological idols. You ever known somebody whose view of God was so distorted that they eventually wound up worshiping a God of their own creation? You ever known somebody like that? He then talked about the idea of sexual idols. And again, all you have to do, turn on the news, go on social media later today, and you'll see endless examples of what he was referring to. Pornography, homosexuality, human trafficking, transgenderism. I mean, it just goes on and on. For the first time in history, we have a percentage of the population who now identify themselves primarily in terms of their sexuality. First time that's ever happened. Here's some other categories he mentions. Racial idols, cultural idols, religious idols, relational idols, and even I'm going to say this, even political idols. You know anybody that's allowed the party they support or the person that they support to become an idol for them? You know anybody? Don't look at them if they're here. I mean, that'd be awkward. Let me just throw this in as a side note, okay? If the people who know you best know more about who you support and what party you vote for than they know about what you believe about Jesus, you're doing it wrong. Throw that out there. Later in the book, Tim Keller asks a series of 4 questions that are meant to help you identify. So we're going to put these up. You may want to write these down if you need to work through them later. Here's the first question. What do you daydream about? What is it that you find yourself thinking about when you're not thinking about anything? Number 2, what do you most fear? Another way to think about it is what could you lose that if you lost it, you think your life would no longer be worth living? Is it your job, your position, your money, your house, whatever it is? Third question, what fills you with irrational anger, anxiety, despondency, or guilt? And then lastly, what do you effortlessly spend money on? If you want to know what your idols are, you go home today, go through your checkbook, your credit card statement, and your calendar for the last couple months. And in the midst of all that, you'll figure out pretty quick what it is that's captured your heart. So what is it that eats up most of your time? What is it that takes priority over your relationship with God? How about this? What is it that whenever you're forced to choose between that thing and actually worshiping God, you almost always choose that thing? If you can identify that, then it's a pretty good indication of what your idol might be. And then once you identify whatever it is, you move to the second step in this process and you begin to to dismantle that idol. You see Moses do this in verse 19. When Moses approached the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, his anger burned, and he threw the tablets out of his hands, breaking them to pieces at the foot of the mountain. And he took the calf the people had made and burned it in the fire. Then he ground it to powder, scattered it on the water, and made the Israelites drink it. He then turns his attention to Aaron, who, just like some of us, rather than taking responsibility, immediately begins looking for somebody else to blame. Verse 21, he said to Aaron, what did these people do to you that you led them into such great sin? Do not be angry, my lord. Aaron answered, you know how prone these people are to evil. They said to me, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him. So I told them, whoever has any gold jewelry, take it off. Then they gave me the gold, and I threw it in the fire, and out came this calf. Yeah, right. Like you wish you had a time machine, right? You'd go back and see Moses. Aaron knows that's not true. Moses knows that's not true. And yet Moses does the thing that somebody had to do, and he dismantles this idol. He burns it down, he scatters it, and he makes the people drink it as a physical reminder of what they've done. But what I want you to catch is that Moses is not taking any chances. Once he identified the idol, he immediately began to dismantle. And it's a great example to us because the mistake that a lot of us make whenever it comes to this issue is that we like to convince ourselves that our relationship with God and our relationship with our idols can somehow peacefully coexist. And it's like we say to ourselves, yes, I'm going to be all in on my relationship with God, but I'm also going to give myself wholeheartedly to this other thing. And you can just sort of fill in the blank with whatever that thing is for you. It might be your career, might be some addiction, might be your wealth, sports, popularity, political stuff, personal pleasures, entertainment, or any of the thousands of other things that compete for our attention. One famous theologian said, our hearts are perpetual idol-making factories. And what he meant by that is, as human beings, we possess this incredible ability to make an idol out of anything. You've fallen victim to that, and I have too. None of us are immune. But what inevitably happens is that eventually there are these violent collisions that take place in which the demands of our idols and the demands of God come into conflict. And when they do, there are some extremely difficult choices that have to be made. And that leads to the third thing. So you identify it, you dismantle it, and then at some point, you have to replace it. Be honest with you, the easiest thing in the world for me to do this week would have been to stop at the end of verse 24 and hope that you didn't go home and read the rest of the chapter sometime this week. Because when you get to verse 25, you see Moses do something that cuts against the grain of everything that we think we know about who God is. And I want you to look this with me, but as we look at this, I want you to know this is going to be uncomfortable. Verse 25. Moses saw that the people were running wild and that Aaron had let them get out of control and so become a laughing stock to their enemies. So he stood at the entrance of the camp and he said, whoever is for the Lord, come to me. And all the Levites rallied to him. Then he said to them, this is what the Lord your God of Israel says. Each man strap a sword to his side, go back and forth through the camp from each end to the other, each killing his brother and friend and neighbor. The Levites did as Moses commanded, and that day about 3,000 of the people died. Then Moses said, you have been set apart to the Lord today, for you were against your own sons and brothers, and he has blessed you this day. Earlier I told you, the one thing the Bible teaches is no matter how much you've messed up, no matter how much you've turned away, God is always willing to forgive. He wants to be in a restored relationship with us. But then you read this part of the story, it doesn't make any sense, right? Like, why would God choose violence? Why would Moses lead the execution of 3,000 members of the community. But believe it or not, I think what you see here at the end of Exodus 32, rather than being seen as an act of vengeance, should be seen as a display of God's mercy. Because you go back to verse 26, Moses began this confrontation with the people by giving them a choice. And he said, whoever is for the Lord, come to me. So this is not some arbitrary decision. The invitation was open to anybody who wanted to come. It's just that then, just like now, not everybody chose to come. And so, when the consequences of their decision came to fruition, there was nothing left to be done. They made their choice, and then they had to live with the consequences of their decision. But here's the problem. Because we live in this anything goes kind of culture in which a lot of us have mistakenly convinced ourselves that, hey, as long as you try hard to be a good person and you don't do anything too bad, then it doesn't really matter what you believe or who you worship. And then we read something like this, and we have a hard time processing that there are some decisions that really do matter. And there are some decisions that really are life and death decisions. That's why centuries later, when he sat down to write the letter that we call 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul wrote these words. He said, therefore, my dear friends, flee from idolatry. Your translation might say, run away from false gods. Notice he doesn't say, do your best to manage your idolatry. And he doesn't say, try really hard not to let your idolatry become too much of a problem. Instead, he says, whatever you do, run as fast as you can from idolatry, because if you don't, it may kill you. Psalm 106, David, who would later become Israel's greatest king, looked back over Israel's history, and he summarized what happened in Exodus 32 with these words. He said, at Horeb, which is another word for Sinai, they made a calf and worshipped an idol cast from metal. They exchanged their glorious God for an image of a bull which eats grass. They forgot the God who saved them, who'd done great things. You read that, even on the surface, it sounds so stupid, right? Like, who would do that? Who would forget the God that did all of this to go worship a God that you know is fake? It makes zero sense. It's kind of like going to an auction and bidding $3.4 million on a painting that you know is not the real thing. When I told you that story earlier, some of you immediately thought, that's crazy. Like, why would anybody do that? And it's a fair question. But there's a better question. It's this: why would anybody spend their life worshiping something and giving themselves to something that deep down inside they know is a false God, when they have an opportunity to be in a relationship with the true God? I want you to stand with me. Some of you walked in here this morning, you had no idea what we were going to be talking about. And to be honest, this may be something that you've never even thought about. But it's possible that over these last few moments, the Holy Spirit has brought something to your attention that's become an idol for you. Maybe it started out as a good thing, but it was never meant to be the ultimate thing, which is what you've allowed it to become. If that's your situation, I want to ask you to do two things that both may be difficult to do. First, I want to challenge you that if you know what it is, that you begin the process of dismantling it. It may not be easy to do, and it may be a long process, but whatever you do, don't allow it to linger. Don't allow it to become the thing that steals from you your present life and your eternal life. Make sure you deal with it. The second thing I want to ask you to do is to choose to replace it. Some of you may be, and you now that you know what your issue is, you need to commit your life to following Jesus. Maybe it's the first time, or maybe for you, you need to recommit your life to Christ in a fresh way. We're going to sing a couple final songs together. You want to pray with somebody, you want to talk to somebody, I'll be here, Austin's here. We'd be glad to answer any questions, to pray with you for as long as you need us to, and try to help you take that next step. Whatever it is you need to do, we hope you'll do it.